Hi, and thanks for tuning into this episode of Getting Data Done. This is one of a number of episodes in a playlist in the Let's Get Data Done channel, where I chat with all sorts of data people about the kind of data challenges or opportunities they faced, what they did with those challenges and opportunities, and of course, how that went. And in this episode, I chat with a lovely chap called Christopher Chin. And Christopher and I connected on LinkedIn some time ago, and he very kindly agreed to give me some of his valuable time for this episode. And I recorded this episode late in the day, Friday. It's been a really, really busy week. And yeah, I have to, I think, apologise for my poor delivery in this episode. Lots of umming and ahhing from me. And that's particularly relevant to Christopher, actually, because as well as his career in data, he also does an amazing job in helping data and IT professionals to speak confidently and deliver confident presentations. So I could probably do with tapping into some of Christopher's wisdom to help me do better next time, I think. But anyway, enough of my excuses. Don't pay attention to me. Definitely pay attention to Christopher, highly skilled orator, as you'll see in a moment and hear in a moment. And enjoy the episode. Okay, so hi Christopher. Really good to speak to you. Thanks for giving us a bit of time today. So we connected on LinkedIn recently, of course, and you very kindly agreed to spend a bit of time with me chatting about some data challenges or data opportunities that you came across and how you responded to those and how it went. And this is all part of what I'm trying to do more of now, which is hear from some real data people and hear about the experiences that people are having when trying to do great things with data. So welcome. Thanks for giving us some time. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much, Phil, for having me on the show. Very nice to finally meet you. I know we've been connected for a while on LinkedIn, so this is always a pleasure. And to introduce myself, currently my line of work is acting as a public speaking coach for tech professionals. But before that, my area of expertise was data visualization, data storytelling. So I would work in capacities as a senior data analyst, essentially, in various organizations to create dashboards, to create reports, take that raw data and turn it into actionable insight. So that was a huge part of my career, and that really launched my current interest in focusing on communication, because in the data industry in particular, technical skills are, of course, so important, but soft skills are the ones that really get you to the end zone, essentially. It gets you from the raw data, all the information within it, and then having an impact on the business. Yeah. So the challenge that I wanted to talk about today is one that I faced in one of my previous companies. I was working on a team, and there were two of us on this team, myself, and one other person for the purposes of this conversation, I'll call him Aaron. So Aaron and I were working on this data team, and we are specializing in data visualization. So the task given to us was to analyze data related to APIs. So there are APIs in-house in this company I'm working at, and people are calling these APIs. There are successful calls to this API. There are unsuccessful calls to this API. And our goal as the two analysts on this team was to create dashboards of this data. And you can imagine that this data consists of logs of the transactions to this API. So logs of every single ping to the API. Was it successful? Was it not successful? If it was not successful, what was the error message? And additional metadata about the time that the transaction took place. So we had all this raw data and it was placed in a database for us to use. So that's the data layer, essentially. And our task, Aaron and myself, was to take that raw data and turn it into two different dashboards. So you can imagine there's the raw data and then it bifurcates into two different dashboards that Aaron and myself are creating. And this was the cause of the primary challenge with this particular example that I'm giving, because what happened was we were tasked with, I'll give an example for one metric. So success rate was the metric we wanted to visualize, one of them at least. And so this was defined as the number of successful calls to this API divided by the total number of calls to this API. So in a percentage, like 90% successful. So we both had to define this metric in our individual dashboards. And that's where the problems can arise, because of course, we can define them differently if we don't communicate with each other. Now, we agreed upon the definition. We agreed, okay, this is how we define successful calls over total calls. That was a very simple metric to define. But when it came down to calculating that metric, that's where some issues arise, because the data itself, as you can imagine, as I'm sure you've experienced many times, was very messy. Yep. So these logs had a field called date, and those dates were strings, and the formats were inconsistent. So sometimes you could have the month spelled out in full, sometimes not. Sometimes a strange time zone coded format. And the task of the analysts, of Aaron and myself, was to transform that raw data, that raw string field, and all the other fields into usable formats. So we needed to have a series of transformational steps to take that raw string, convert it into a date. And Aaron and myself had, of course, different approaches to doing that, which resulted in us having different values for the metric. And this was an eye-opening moment for me, because we had both created our dashboards. We had both put them into production. They were being used by end users in production. And I believe it was during a demo of the two dashboards that we had created. We were looking at the same time range. And we were looking at that one metric for success rate. And they were different numbers. And of course, someone would ask, so what's going on here? Why are they different numbers for the same time range, for the same metric? What's the problem? And that made me really look into how we're going about this data analysis process, this workflow. And I isolated the issue to what I mentioned at the beginning. It's that bifurcation from the data layer to individual dashboards, the business logic being in the tool. We use Power BI at the time, in the tool itself, and not defined in the common central semantic layer. That was the cause of the problem. And looking back in hindsight, I would have approached this situation differently. But because this was in production, this was an urgent issue, I said, okay, I can make a quick fix. If you and I share the files, our dashboard files in Power BI, let's figure out where we differ. So I looked at Aaron's file, I found his series of transformational steps. I isolated where it differed from mine, and I said, okay, I'll fix it, and then the metrics aligned finally in production. So issue resolved. But the actual issue at play is still at large, because there's going to be a situation in the future where we define metrics the same, but our series of transformational steps will differ in our different dashboard files, and we'll have another discrepancy in production. What I would recommend to a lot of analysts who face a similar situation is really think about standardizing your workflow from beginning to end. So think about, you have the data layer, think about having a common semantic layer after that, where you define all your business logic, all your calculations in common, and then all the analysts use that. So we use the same value of the metric, the same transformational steps. There's none of this discrepancy that happens in our individual files. So that was the big challenge that I faced, and how I approached it, how I would approach it differently with all I've learned since, but how I had to approach it at that time.
Cool. No, great story. Thanks for sharing, Christopher. So, one thing springs to mind straight away, and I think as you kind of described there, is the role of those business rules and how those business rules feed into interpretation of the data. And we often think about data interpretation as being a sort of last stage in the data thing, don't we? We put the data into analytics, presenting it in something like a dashboard, as you've described, and then we're interpreting the data. But of course, interpretation happens on the data upstream from that, doesn't it? In the people who are involved, like yourself and Aaron there, in turning the raw data into the dashboard. And of course, that's where we need to get clarity on those business rules and the technical rules really that exist around the data or act upon the data, so that we can all be on the same page in terms of how to transform the data. I mean, is that something? Was this a large organization? Was it? I'm interested in how the situation developed where you and Aaron were upstream in that data flow, both applying different interpretations to the data.
Right, this was a large organization. And what was interesting about the team was it was relatively new. So we were kind of figuring out how to go about our analytics workflow. And we were all testing out different things. We didn't have standardized processes. So this was a teachable moment for us to understand how to implement processes better going into the future. And I think another point where there could be issues is even more upstream in that process, the stakeholders, and defining metrics with them up front. So if they told us, hey, we want a success rate metric, if we just left it at that and then tried to figure out what that means ourselves, that could lead to problems in the end. They say, oh, that's not what we meant by success rate. You need to talk to them about, what do you mean? Do you mean, and then we define it in the formula. This is what you mean? Yes, this is what you mean. And then we go on and implement it. So that communication all the way upstream is very important.
I think that's a fairly common challenge, but despite the fact that I certainly feel like it's quite common, I don't think it's felt as being common with a lot of business users of the data. I think many people who have been involved in transforming data into analytics has encountered some kind of that situation where the analyst is saying to the business user, like you just described, Christopher, what is it you're trying to see from the data? What do you mean by that metric? And that can either be a difficult question for the business user to answer, or if it's not a difficult question for them to answer, they'll come up with a different answer to maybe one of their colleagues elsewhere in the organisation, and that whole situation can lead to a situation like the one you described, where the actual job, and it's a super responsible job, isn't it? The actual job of deciding how it is we're going to take these raw data and transform them into this metric is left with people like the analysts, right? And I mean, was that the kind of situation you feel like you were in your example?
Certainly. And I think that also brings another question of, is this the right metric to begin with that we should be showing?
Yeah.
What is the underlying problem that the stakeholder wants to solve? So is success rate necessarily the best metric for what they need? If they want to actually figure out where are the errors, then maybe error rate or something like that would be better to show on the dashboard instead of success rate. And then on the dashboard show, here's the days or the dates, this time range where the errors were highest, then we can dive more into detail about what's going on there. So it really comes down to understanding what's the underlying root problem, and then from there figuring out what metrics are useful to address that, and then defining those clearly.
Yeah, okay. If I can, I'd like to ask you what sort of changes would have helped the situation that you described, and I guess also what kind of advice you'd give to organisations who are detecting this challenge within their business. What kind of different approach can an organisation make to ensure that we're not leaving analysts sort of unsupported in this really, really important task of deciding what the right metrics should be. The business users recognise that the accountability and responsibility for doing that really sits in the business. What sort of advice would you perhaps give to an organisation to not just understand that, but tell them how best to approach that challenge?
I'd highly recommend communication.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is frequent communication with your stakeholders to make sure everyone's on the same page. And the organization I worked at before, we focused on the agile methodology, where you have essentially 2-week work cycles. You plan work for the 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, you say, how did we do? What do we plan for the next 2 weeks? And then you iterate. And in that way, you make sure that you're continuously improving and getting towards your goal without defining things all the way up front, not really understanding the problem, and then you develop it and it turns out not to be the fit. So having a continuous improvement mindset, continuously talking to the stakeholders to make sure you're all on the same page, that, hey, let's present to you a proof of concept. Does this work for what you want? If not, then let's iterate upon that. And it comes down to not only those frequent meetings, but also having those standard operating procedures that I was talking about before. So we were a relatively new team, but for a more seasoned team, having those workflows established is important. So saying, okay, we have the data. Now let's put that in a central semantic layer, and then everybody calls upon that. And everybody does that for any project that we do, no matter what. That's important to establish. So those would be the main things I recommend. And I think analysts having comfort with that communication is vital to that process succeed. Because if analysts are kind of stuck in their technical role and not necessarily seeing how their work can impact business in the positive way, they won't direct their work into that direction. So making sure that analysts understand the business impact of their work, understanding the business context, how does the business make money? How can we tailor our work to make sure that happens? That connection between tech and business is so important.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I often do is talk in the language of the jobs that data have to do, right? So when we think about the role of data insights and analytics in helping an organization to be, and it's that common phrase, data-driven, right? We want to be a data-driven organization. Of course, that should mean that data is helping to drive the organization to achieve its goals. So we need insights that are going to help us, help the people in this organization to operate processes in ways that improve the achievement of our goals. So one of the things that we often try to do is help people in the business to foresee what that looks like. Think, okay, well, if this is the outcome that you're seeking to achieve, how do processes actually work to achieve that outcome? And now what information is going to be, what data insights is going to be helpful and relevant to those processes for achieving those goals? And use that sort of thinking. What job as a data insight is it that we need data to do? Use that thinking to help people to just understand, okay, yeah, specifically we need to know exactly this metric, and that metric needs to be formed in this way, and just sort of putting that top-down thinking into that that important job of answering the question. Yeah, just like you said, what does the metric need to be? So that information can be handed to the analysts. So yeah, as I say, they're not sort of solely responsible for coming up with the answers there. And I think that combined with the agile approach that you've mentioned, to make sure that we haven't tried to completely foresee everything. It's very hard to tell sometimes exactly what the metric needs to be. Well, let's get to the best possible answer we can for now. Let's feed that into the analytics process. Let's see what the results are coming out, and if we're not quite there, that's fine. We can iterate through and make the necessary adjustments.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to add on to that, I believe that one of the things that stops these processes from being completely successful is also everybody speaking different languages. So analysts, we speak a very technical language. We're very granular in the approach that we take. But the business is at the kind of like the 10,000 foot view. They're looking down and seeing how all these processes work together to help the business be profitable. So it comes down to everybody trying to become more on the same page. So as I mentioned before, for analysts, trying to understand the business better. And in fact, in one of my recent organizations, they emphasized that in the first few weeks I joined the job, I really understand how the business worked. How does it make money? Let me set up meetings with everybody I wanted to try and learn as much as possible about that, how that works. And that's so important. But also on the other side of it, it's important for the business to also have a certain level of data literacy. And in one of my previous organizations, that was a huge push that they were going for. They really wanted executives, managers, people reading the dashboards to be data literate, so understand how to read the graphs, how to drive the insights, so that we can all essentially speak the same language, or at least as close to that as possible.
Yeah, I think these are really good, really important aspects of not ending up just data busy. I talk about data busy a lot, don't I? There's the opposite of data driven is data busy, and being in a situation where people are data illiterate, so that it's hard to fulfill the kind of challenge that you've described today of turning data into insights, and allowing too much guesswork to come into that is what can definitely mean you end up spending far too much time and energy and investment on just sort of stumbling your way to the right answer, rather than actually putting a bit of targeted thinking on it.
I agree. And another solution that I thought about in relation to the example I gave was also something that I learned from software engineering, which is more of a test-driven development approach. And what that would mean is that instead of creating your solution and then testing at the end to make sure everything works, and then if something's wrong, going back and fixing everything, instead approaching it from, let's create a test and make sure that our work continuously succeeds in that test. That way you're not always chasing what went wrong at the beginning, but you're always on target. So implementing an approach where testing is also standardized is very important. So in the example that I gave before, where the success rates were different, how did that go into production when it was tested? It was thoroughly tested by the tester, but something was clearly missed in that process. So we need to understand what was missed. How can we ensure that doesn't happen in the future? There's no way we can test every possible combination of filters that the user can put and then make sure that everything aligns. But it comes down to maybe implementing some automation in that process. So are there certain metrics we can automate in the testing and really being more standardized with that process overall?
Yeah, I think there needs to be that balance, doesn't there? Definitely between top down and bottom up. There's definitely value that data can provide to us by giving us answers to questions that maybe we haven't even thought to ask. That's that bottom up approach. But I've always said that bottom up approach, certainly in terms of developing data capabilities and data insights capabilities, that needs to, or at least should, come after a top-down approach. Before we get into that bottom-up approach, that kind of represents the later stage on our data capability cycle. We first need to have the capability of knowing what answers we need from the data. We know how we need to operate as an organization to achieve our goals. Let's use that awareness and that understanding to translate into a subsequent understanding of what is it we need to know. I use the phrase often, know what, so what, now what. We need to know what it is we need to know. We need to know, so what will that mean to us? And then, of course, we need to know what to do with it, now what. So coming at it through that approach of, okay, let's put some thinking into this up front, and as you say, let's not just kind of have a go and leave it all to chance. Yes, we can use an agile approach to adjust and sort of course correct if needs be, but we need to take a balanced approach of trying to preempt as much as possible, or anticipate as much as possible what it is that we can learn from our data that's going to help the business to achieve its goals.
I agree, and I really like that framework, the what, so what, now.
Know what, so what, now.
It's an excellent framework, and the reason why it is because a lot of presenters, when they're giving a presentation in general, they focus just on the what, because that's just the slides, the material on the slides, everything you think that would be important to present, everything that you worked on.
Yeah.
But then, what does that mean? Why does it matter? That's the so what.
Yeah.
And the so what is really what the people in your audience want to listen for. They don't just want the what, they want to know why it matters. Yeah. So the so what is so important. And the now what, even more so, is more important than that, because you need to know not only why it's important, but what can we do to make sure that we can solve the challenges that we're facing. Yeah. So those 3 steps, they're key.
Yeah, cool. No, I'm glad you like that. It is, it's kind of an interesting, but I would admit slightly uncomfortable conversation that I still have with some business leaders when they're talking about just how much effort and investment has gone into a new suite of analytics and dashboards, and maybe a new data warehouse or data lake. And then my question comes a little bit later on, which is, how much investment did you put into making sure that people who are being provided with that information, provided with those insights, are supported and are trained in how to interpret them and how to apply them, the so what, now what piece. And of course, unfortunately, quite often the answer is not much at all. Actually, we've invested a lot into the technologies and the platforms to deliver those insights, and the people to use those tools, of course, but haven't invested really much at all in the so what and the now what. And of course, the sort of colour can drain from their faces when they realise that kind of really means that they've left all of that investment to chance in terms of returns. I think definitely agree with you. It's super important.
Exactly. Yeah. And that comes down to the question of dashboards and their utility, because a lot of people believe that dashboards are data storytelling. But most of the time dashboards are just data exploration. They're just a way for people to play around and figure out what's going on, but they don't really tell a story end to end, why something happened, what should we do from now on. And different tools are really needed for that process. So I really agree with your approach, where you're saying don't only invest in the tools and technologies that can only get you so far. Think about how to use those tools and technologies to advance your business goals.
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. Thanks, Christopher. I have a very clear feeling I could chat with you for ages, but I guess we should start to wrap up now. Are there any sort of final passing thoughts or comments that you'd like to summarize with?
I think that my final comment would be, don't just focus on the technical parts, as we've talked about, the tools and technologies. Also focus on that soft skill aspect, the communication of the insights from those tools and technologies. That's where the real business value is derived, because you can have the most amazing dashboard, you can have the most amazing insights, but if they're not communicated well, then they won't have the impact that you want. And the other comment that I would make is make sure you have those standard procedures in place to make sure you don't leave things chance, as we've been talking about, but make sure that you have a process in place to be successful throughout the whole process and avoid pitfalls that can inevitably arise if you don't have them.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Very wise words, I think, Christopher. And I've, as I was mentioning to you earlier, I've been really enjoying your content online about exactly what you just mentioned there. Really is how to deliver information as well as insights in a really effective and clear way to make sure that their sort of full power and potential is realised. In addition to following you online, I mean, are there any kind of resources that you'd like to point viewers or listeners to this episode to?
Yeah, so there's my LinkedIn profile where I post content about communication and data and presentation. And also my site is thehiddenspeaker.com, where I have more resources, more long form content about data storytelling, presentation, and communication. So feel free to check that out as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christopher. Yeah, well, I say your content definitely helps me out, so it's been a real pleasure to chat with you today, and I hope everyone who's tuned in has found this information as useful, certainly as I have, and of course it goes without saying, if you've enjoyed listening to this chat and you'd like to hear more, then do all the usual things, so like and subscribe, and we'll I'm sure get together again sometime in the future and talk more about how to get data done. Thanks, Christopher.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Phil, for having me.
Thank you. Cheerio.